Thank you everybody for joining us today on this webinar around the ESRS, another acronym from the EU, but a very potent one, I think, as we'll discuss today. So we have this webinar, and I'll say a little bit more about the background in a few minutes, mostly to discuss some of the high-level implications, because we think they're worthy to discuss right now. There's a lot of things happening right now around, of course, the EU regulatory debates. There's also a DI event, Danske Industri event, on the same topic on June 17th that you may want to join, but I think we'll get back to that. And sorry for the joining noises you might hear in the background as I go along. So we are lucky to have with us here today Lene Bjørn Serpa, who is Head of Corporate Sustainability and ESG from Maersk, as well as Törnqvist, who's SVP at Danske Bank. Luckily, the two of them are very closely tied into many of these discussions on the European level. So I think they have a lot of insights and reflections on what those broader implications are from these standards as we are seeing them come to light. So our agenda for today is that we'll start very much with a small introduction on my end on what what are we been talking about, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And I'll also start some of the shifts that we see from Nordic sustainability side, and then I'll hand over the word to Per, who will talk a little bit more on the fly and from an investor perspective, and then we hear from Lene about some of her reflections of how it might affect her work at Maersk. Thanks again to both of you for joining. And then afterwards, we have a 25-minute Q&A period. So feel free to jot down any sort of questions you might have in the chat as we go along, or using the Q&A function preferably. Again, we hope there's lots of questions. We have a lot of people coming today, I think. So please feel free to just hammer us with those questions as much as you would like, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible. Just jumping straight into it, just to discuss a little bit about the background. For those of us who don't, those of you who don't know us, we are Nordic Sustainability. We are Copenhagen-based sustainability strategy consultancy, and we very much try to have the end goal of an actual sustainable company in mind when we talk to companies and we do sustainability strategy processes. I think most of us here recognize that most companies still have a way to go. We always symbolize it with this sustainability transformation line. That's of course very much qualitative. But again, I brought it up as well to just talk about, I think even for many of the sustainability leaders, some of those we have on the call today, the European sustainability reporting standards will be quite a challenge and will push the agenda ahead if they are passed in the way they're currently framed. Now, for the background of what we're talking about today, we have, of course, there's a range of regulatory aspects coming from EU level, and I think Per will tell us a little bit more about that in a second, or draw up the wider picture. I have some of these other initiatives noted down on the right. But what we're mainly concerned with today is, of course, the ESRS, and just to orient where that ESRS is located. It's one of the, under the CSRD, one of the key three pillars under the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan. One of the pillars is already very much on everybody's mind, which is the EU taxonomy, which tries to, of course, define more what are the sustainable activities, or what activities, economic activities, can we call sustainable in our societies. The SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which then tries to get investments directed into those sustainable economic activities. And then we have the CSRD, which tries to ensure that we actually get the right data from companies to make better investment decisions, to allow better comparison of company activities from the outside. And underneath that, and I think a little bit, given how far we need to drill, belying a little bit the significance of these standards almost, is the ESRS, which is kind of the technical articulation of many of the disclosure standards that will come under this regulation, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And when we look at what's entailed in the standard, so this is kind of the map overview of what the current draft that was circulated, the last bits of it by the end of April, contains. These are every little box here stands for a guidance document. Together they make up a few hundred pages of guidance and documentation. So if it feels slightly overwhelming, I think it will continue to do so for a few years in this space, which is of course also why we discussed it today. But basically what's underneath is a range of cross-cutting guidance documents and standards that talk more generally about how do you report on your activities, how do you talk about your strategy, your governance, how do you do the materiality processes. Then there's a lot of guidance around some of the ESG areas, right? The environment, the social and the governance specific areas that are also very much covered in the EU taxonomy. And then we will have some more sector-specific guidance that's coming later in 2023 that's still under work. And then there's a range of information, a range of guidance about how to do presentations, conceptual guidance, backup appendices on how we define and creating a common definition space for many of these areas. And what's been released in April is very much the ones marked in this red-orangey color, and they're currently in hearing phase. So this is also an open invitation. If you or your companies you work for have any inputs or reflections on these, make sure that you bring them up on as part of this hearing phase, because of course they may still be adjusted, the standards over time. With that, of course, we're also discussing a preliminary view of all of this right now, which is also why we're trying to keep the conversation more on the level of what are the implications of what we currently see out there, what are the character, rather than specific phrases in the regulation. Now, in terms of the overall timeline we're working with, it's the draft standards were released end of April. There's a hearing period now until I think the 8th of August. We then have in the current timeline until the end of the year, where these first set of standards are supposed to be adopted. And I think in the current timeline, the idea is that reporting on these standards would happen already for the financial year 2023. That means you'd have to include this in your reports by early 24. I think there's some discussions right now that may actually be shifted, given the proximity of that, well, how close we already are to 23, and of course the fact that companies would then by now be very close to having built up some of that reporting capability to actually get the data. So we'll see if it's postponed by a year, but nevertheless, in any case, of course, there's not a lot of time given the significance of some of what we're talking about here. So why, from our perspective, do we think it's relevant to discuss this from a more strategic level? I think besides, of course, the timing and the proximity, we at Nordic Sustainability think there's three major shifts. One is that double materiality is absolutely central to the way the ESR, the EU sees sustainability. Secondly, it's very clear that the entire value chain is in focus for the EU, and thirdly, that there's a much clearer link between many of the disclosure definitions and business strategy and business models than I think we've seen before. And I'll go just briefly through each of those in turn. Firstly, on double materiality, for those of you not quite deeply nerding about the space as much as some of us do, double materiality, of course, is the view that we both want to look at what's financially material, so what kind of outside impacts or outside influences might have an impact on the financial value or the company itself. And the other side, the impact materiality, so inside out, what kind of impact does the company have on the environment? And sometimes they overlap because, for example, climate change, both the companies is affecting, but also climate change has a potential risk implications. But sometimes they're also not, an impact materiality is much wider because it's just not financial material yet. And what's basically changing is with the EU, with the draft standards right now, is that, again, double materiality is centered, but there are some interesting phrasing where impact materiality is also seen as a starting point a lot of times, because, again, usually what's material or the material impact that a company has on the world over time tend to become financially material. Companies will be asked to rank a lot of the impacts, and it's a very broad materiality definition that's brought here. Why is it significant? I think it's significant because today's approach to materiality is relatively immature. Many of you know the rather qualitative approaches to materiality that we see in sustainability reports. I think stakeholder demands are very much going to shift, of course, to that lens of double materiality. And right now, we are missing, of course, more acknowledged or standard methods of doing impact materiality or doing double materiality, those kinds of concepts, or we're just developing slowly what we think is adequate materiality reporting on that side. I think the implications, of course, are that companies will need to work much more in depth with the materiality topics and define materiality more in depth. You'll probably have to puzzle together for a while the different standards that are out there, whether it's Future Fit or SASP or TCFD, and probably also rely more on expert input to really try to get to grips with what the actual impacts are that you have. But we also believe that because it's such a much wider lens, top management will need to build much more capacity around these issues to understand and manage the impacts and risks of opportunities going forward. A second part is that there's a much stronger transparency requirement on value chain work. I mean, I think many of you have also seen over the past years, we moved from basically having a world where companies have to prevent the worst activities from happening, whether it's child labor or major chemical spills in their supply chains, to having to now manage Scope 3, manage their emissions in their supply chain. And I think this is another push where companies will be liable to manage impacts much more broadly in their supply chain. So it's quite clear that in the view of the EU, in this draft, all types of impacts across the entire value chain and also supplier tiers are in scope. They specifically mentioned an example of cobalt in electronic products, for example, and the mining implications of that. So all the way up in the supply chain tiers. And it's also clear from the way it's presented that a lot of times not having data is not an excuse. That there's a much more demand on companies to actually get that data, find out what's happening in their supply chain, disclose how potential data gaps are being closed, and be transparent about methodologies. Again, why it's significant is that that's just very far from where we are at right now in the debate and in the ability to look into our supply chains. Again, there will, of course, with that linking of impacts to companies, be a much stronger responsibility shift. And it also means that the additional transparency that we'll see from that will likely mean that infringements and impacts will be much more immediately visible to stakeholders and so be having to be managed, right? So companies will need to create systems and processes to know more about their supply chains. They probably need to make much stronger risk trade-off calculations of business model decisions to source parts or produce in certain places, as we already see, of course, also now with the wider context of what's happening in Ukraine and others. And of course, that may mean certain business models and supply chain practices may become less viable than they are now. Last point for me before I hand over to Per is that, and I mentioned this already a couple of times, there's a much stronger link to the business and business implications in many of these documents. There are quite a few places where the documents talk about linking impacts to the business model, even on, for example, product revenue level or product category level, to linking them to R&D investments, to circular revenue, and all these kinds of this type of language. And there's also a requirement to disclose or be much more transparent about how you as a company might make business model adjustments to mitigate those impacts. And again, that's significant because it'll create a lot more visibility of how impacts are tied to a company's business model, and with that create a lot more pressure to do active adjustments to business models and do much more extensive sub-disclosures on biodiversity, on circular business models, on investments. And that, of course, has strong strategic implications because, again, you will have to take these, or companies and top management will have to take these kinds of risks and impacts much more into account when thinking about different sourcing, different business model strategies. And I just brought this slightly provocative graphic from one, I think, the really good thinkers in this field. If you feel that this might adequately describe your supply chain as a company, then I think that's you're probably not alone. But I think it probably is a bit symbolic for the type of adjustments we're going to have to do over time. So that was my intro. With that, I'll hand over to Per to guide us through some of the more overall.
Thank you. I think I have used this heading many times to speak, and this is the 61st time I'm doing this since the beginning of February. It is a big topic, and it is a transformative topic. If we move to the next slide, please. I think that tells it all in a sense. We are here exactly. Because when we talk about the EU Sustainable Finance Strategy and what it results in, it is, in my view, the biggest change to accounting since the invention of accounting, because it transforms the way we need to think about financial steering and financial reporting. And that fact is critical here. We are looking at something that the EU has put together, which is far more than just the taxonomy. A lot has been said about the taxonomy, but frankly, it's a detail. It's important, yes, but it's a detail nonetheless, right? It defines certain activities as sustainable for now, under certain circumstances, and we can agree and disagree. The social taxonomy does a bit of the same. The social taxonomy draws a line under what's stated already in the green taxonomy, and namely human rights. And human rights is probably the respect for human rights is probably one of the more critical elements of this whole setup, because it defines countries that do respect human rights as, you can argue, open for business, whilst those that do not become problematic for your sourcing. And then anyone on this call should understand that, okay, so now we're talking transforming value chains, indeed. Transforming value chains where the disclosure that we as an investor, as a financial institution, are given the task to say no or yes, obviously, i.e. to analyze and make a very deliberate decision on whether or not we want to continue business with a given customer under the requirements that now prevail, and we will have to make that call. Most of the time, I do believe we will do that by simply discussing and agreeing on how should I put it, transition plans, i.e. there is a positive will in the broader corporate community to indeed transition. But there might also be cases where you cannot transition, or where still do not want to transition, and then that may have consequences. We have not seen the end of this by any means. This is the beginning of a long journey, and the ESRS in many ways crystallizes a lot of what's going on above. You see this in the center of the picture. And what is key here is that the ESRS, the reporting standard, that is defined to a degree by the taxonomies. It certainly is defined further by the SFDR and by CSRD, but in turn it will inform the taxonomies and the SFDR, and thereby creating a feedback loop for further disclosure and further understanding. And I think there are 4 takeaways that are truly strategic here. It is the board's responsibility to identify and measure all material sustainability risks. And once they are identified, do something about them. So the corrective responsibility is also equally important. And this will be reported in the annual report. And this creates a lot of second thinking in boardrooms, and should do so, because if I lie in the annual report, there are consequences. And I don't want to do that. And that means that sustainability reporting, that when I started in this field was mainly about making brochures with pretty pictures and communicating branding content, turns into serious financial reporting. And serious financial reporting that needs to be audited and needs to meet the disclosure requirements of proper financial communication. And this is the big change that even though there is still some time, I think we can safely say the introduction will come in 23 with the first reporting year in 24, meaning the first reports will be out in like February 25. That's now safe to say, but even so, this is very soon. And you need to start thinking about roles and responsibilities. Who is going to do what? Because we're no longer looking at a passive reporting framework. We're looking at a risk management framework. It's no longer just reporting what happened last year. It's also making projections about what's going to happen in the next 28 years until 2050. And since I do need to comment on enterprise value, the content of forward-looking information relative to backward-looking information in the annual report will change substantially. And this is going to create some significant forecasting challenges, because anyone who thinks they can predict history in the next 28 years is frankly a fool. So we will be making guesses and we will be making forecasts, and we need to be humble about the assumptions that we use. I think I can stop there and say that the 4 points I made about the board's responsibility, material sustainability risks, strategies to address them, and the reporting in the annual report, these are the 4 critical elements of the ESRS, and then there are tons of details.
Great, thanks. Maybe 1 or 2 questions before we move to Lene. In terms of, I mean, because you're also, of course, closely tied into those conversations as we're still in draft stage. What's your expectation on how much we'll see a dilution of these key characteristics as we go into the?
I don't think there will be dilution on the 4 things I mentioned, which are the critical ones, right? And we haven't talked about the architecture of this reporting standard, but it is built on 3 pillars: agnostic standards, sector-specific standards, and entity-specific standards, which is basically an open-ended requirement to understand your externalities. You as a company need to understand what is material in our business. And that might be things you aren't even aware of today. But then you need to become aware, because that is your fiduciary responsibility. Then I believe there will be massive changes when it comes to which KPIs should be mandatory to disclose on, etc. I think that's where the political infighting will be substantial. But these 4 key principles, I don't think are up for grabs.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Bjørn. Actually, I think also just another invitation to everybody to start asking questions if you have some in the Q&A. I think we're just having a few comments that we might look at and start answering. But maybe we'll hear from Lene first and then go back to a more overall discussion on these points. Thanks, Per.
All right, thank you, Sven. So I can start by saying that I've been responsible for sustainability reporting in Maersk for quite a few years now, and Maersk is probably one of the companies that I would consider also to be pretty far advanced in terms of experience with sustainability reporting, but even our outlook on this is with some trepidation in terms of what is coming at us here. And I completely agree with Per's view on the strategic the four key points that you highlight, which I actually also see as extremely important to really ensure that companies work with sustainability reporting, also incorporating those four strategic priorities. But it is in the details, right, that I can still get concerned about what are the which directions will we be pulled in. And so maybe if I start with talking a little bit about how we actually do the reporting today. We continue to have a standalone sustainability report, but it comes out together with on the same day as our annual report. So we see it as part of an overall reporting package. We also increasingly do ESG data reporting, which we see as a supplement and publish online, particularly aligned to investor ESG rating expectations or asks for even more detailed information than we would put in our sustainability report. So the sustainability report we see as this is where we unfold the full narrative around our ESG sustainability strategy. We explain our governance, our strategic priorities, our materiality assessment, our targets, our objectives, performance, etc., on the issues which we have determined to be material, and we report on progress and performance on key performance data, where we get limited assurance on these data as well. So I would say, I think the strategic pillars that you mentioned, Pia, I think I would see us as living up to those overall already in our reporting. But what I think that when I look at the standards that are on the table now, the draft standards, they outline, of course, a much more prescriptive process, right, for us. So both at this, as you say, entity-specific level and sector-specific and company-agnostic level of some quite prescriptive standards for exactly, how to do the materiality assessment, for example, which KPIs to report on, and that could potentially take away, one overall concern, which I think could be interesting to discuss here, is does that actually risk disconnecting, right, reporting from strategy? Because the more that we will be expected or required to report on specific KPIs in a way which perhaps doesn't match the way that we are managing the issues, then we will risk having, one way of internally tracking progress towards some strategic objectives we have set, and then on the other hand, actually being required to report externally on KPIs in another way. And that I think is a problem, because then you actually lose that connect to you exactly do need to have management and boards actually driving these issues and taking responsibility, right? So that I see as a risk. Then in terms of materiality as well, we have actually in Maersk for quite a few years also been working with materiality from different perspectives that more or less align, I would say, with the concept of double materiality, looking at both where our impacts, our responsibilities are to mitigate potential negative impacts, and where sustainability issues can be potential risks to us, so that more financial materiality perspective. But there's also probably quite a way for us to go. The way that we have chosen to do the assessment of sustainability issues as risks to our business, we use our enterprise risk management methodology as the underlying, methodology that we use to assess it. But does that necessarily capture all aspects of enterprise value? Does it include the whole value chain in short, medium, long-term perspective, as the standards actually imply? No, probably not, right? So we have some way to go, I would say. So from that perspective, certainly, I think this is, completely agree also with what has been said. This is a significant change that is coming our way. There's many good reasons, I would say. If you look at why this whole effort has been put in place from the EU's side, it is also, of course, out of a concern to improve the quality of sustainability reporting in general. It is clear that nobody it can be satisfied with brochures and nice pieces of marketing that's no use to anyone. But is it perhaps going too far in the other direction is my concern with the current standards, and are we taking responsibility away from the companies, from the boards and the executives to actually define their material issues themselves, and is there a risk of that disconnect that I mentioned before? But on the other hand, perhaps whether there's it's not that I have a better proposal to throw on the table. Unfortunately, right now, it may be that this is simply a struggle we have to get through in this field of sustainability reporting as we work towards a methodology that actually can cover both the more of the information that is needed to capture both those critical linkages between our business and our impacts and the potential risks, but on the other hand, not getting bogged down simply in too much information. And I think that's maybe also a question I'd like to ask Per, if he sees from the financial sector perspective whether is all this information actually necessary? Will it be useful? Will it be decision useful for the financial sector? And I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lene. Lots of good reflections on this. And maybe we just stick to that information point and with the materiality and reporting for a few questions. I think your question towards Per is a good one to start. To what extent is the information that we're going to generate decision useful? And I think connected to that also, to what extent do we think it might just crowd out further action by just bogging down everybody in further reporting, right? And how might we be able to strike some of that balance?
I think we don't know which information we will need or not, because the materiality task requires a bank to look into its balance sheet. Any investor, any portfolio manager for that matter, to do the same. And you will then find, because you need to mine your data and combine it, it's not a matter of ticking 5 boxes. It's a matter of gradually understanding that, oh, this is the material issue. It wasn't what I thought was the material issue. It's something else. Because if I combine X, Y, and Z industries or processes or whatnot, I will realize here's the issue. This is my biggest concern, really. And as much as I don't believe that we can predict history 30 or odd years into the future, I don't think we have a full, you can say, transparency on what data will be necessary or not. I share the concern that, which you can see from reading the ESRSs, there is an element of activism in the sense you should report on X, Y, and Z because I really don't trust you. And And that is not reporting. That is not materiality identification and risk management, actually. That's just distrust, right? So I think the principles that really drive change here, that's the board responsibility of identifying all material sustainability risks. And given the definition of sustainability and the guidelines that you get from the principles in the ESRS, you can do a good job. But I do believe there's a lot of KPIs that might not be so relevant. And fundamentally, one of the challenges, or two, one is auditing and the other is financial reporting, because there is in the political discussions around CSRD, this idea that you should have a separate auditor for your sustainability report, an auditor other than the one that audits your financial report. And that's really unfortunate, because ultimately your financial reporting and your sustainability reportings are just, the one is just an extension of the other. They are not separate. They're integrated, and they should also then live on the same principles of materiality identification and reporting. And again, I do believe that the way we use the principles can be really forceful in transforming companies and integrating sustainability into business strategies and business models. And making that requirement from the EU is also a good idea. But this caters for many agendas, right? So there's lots of details in here. And if you look at these standards that ESRS has been built from, they are not the silver bullet, any of them, in terms of sustainability reporting. They are just what we have. And what we have is a nascent industry, right? This is not a field that we control because we have 500 years of experience, as with IFRS, right? No, this is something that started a few years ago, and it's been growing ever since, yes, but it's still baby steps and in its infancy, and we need to be humble to that. So there will be whatever comes will be version 1, and then we'll have 2 and 3.11 and Vista and all the others. I mean, there will be versions.
And one of the things I think when I look at the standards and Lene, feel free to also add your reflections on Per's comments afterwards. But when I look at the standards and the depth of reporting needed compared to the depth of what companies disclose right now, there's obviously a huge gap, right? And there's so many more issues, right? And there's so much more, again, that you have to look into your supply chain, broader impacts, more defined impacts. I think also the threshold for what you have to report on to begin with is, of course, much lower now. Given the capacity issues also, and the resource issues in those companies, right? Do you think, just the issue, how can companies start thinking about ranking those issues better in a way that helps investors and others identify what to focus on?
Lene, do you want to kick off?
I can start with that. Well, exactly, Sven. I think that is the challenge, right? So the way when we look at the standards currently, we will actually be required to go through a materiality assessment on all the issues, right? On all the 100 plus disclosure requirements, basically, and then we may reach a conclusion, of course, that some of these are not material, but we will have to be able to basically have some documentation, some proof, right, that we have been through a process to assess it is not material, therefore we are not disclosing on it. So regardless, so it's very difficult the way it's constructed now to say at the outset, this is not material, we will deprioritize this and we will spend more time and resources on the issues that we consider to be most strategic. Basically, everything is considered potentially strategic. And I mean, again, from an impact perspective, it's not that, I think these are the right focus areas actually overall that are covered in the standards. No question about that. But again, it's the level of detail which then underpin each of those in the requirements, where I can have some concern. But then there's no question that what we will need to then develop, and this will be a process that each company will have to go through. There will need to be, we will need, support from others, standard providers also on actually how do we set those thresholds, right? Where is it meaningful? How can we rank issues? So there's no question that this will require, and probably very correctly, as Per also says, a lot of iterations and hopefully improvements to the way that these requirements are set forth going forward. I just want to make one comment also to, Per was mentioning this requirement that actually that the assurance provider for the sustainability reporting should be a different one than the financial auditor, which I can also just add that I completely agree. It does not make much sense to me either. I mean, when the requirement is to integrate, completely into the annual report, and then to require that it's a different auditor, that doesn't seem to make sense at all.
Yeah, maybe one of those detailed aspects that might be changed. There was one. I'm just looking through some of the questions that are coming in. There was one question that's a little bit more detailed on how companies. I think there's some questions about tools for biodiversity. I think maybe that's a little bit more thematic for a biodiversity-related session. There's a question about dynamic materiality, right? How do you keep materiality updated and ensuring that information is still relevant, especially for a company as complex as yours? Lene, right? How do we have some comments also from your view about how often should something like this be updated, and how do you make it dynamic?
Yeah. So again here, so the way that we do it is we would typically do a refresh, I would say, not an in-depth materiality assessment every year, but we would do a refresh of our materiality assessment and to look through, which issues do we see have moved. And that could be based on changes in stakeholder expectations or requirements. It can be changes in our business model as well. But this is certainly an area where the way that we do it today, it is still to a great extent relying on subjective assessments, right? So we will need to have much stronger, I think, structure, documentation in place for this going forward. So it will require more resources, I suspect, definitely. And
I guess you can almost imagine different materiality review triggers as well, and trigger processes that you'll have to embed so that is reviewed and updated.
Yeah.
Well, if I may jump in, I mean, we are looking at a risk management system as much as we're looking at a reporting system. And being a bank is perhaps an advantage because you're so used to regulation that it's almost a surprise if something isn't regulated. Everything more or less is regulated, right? And then you need to have this in-house process, this work process to self-assess. And you need to self-assess on a regular basis. And what banks do already is tons of that type of work in maintaining what's called a risk appetite. And this is exactly what we will have to be doing when it comes to sustainability, and what companies in general will need to start thinking about. How do I review myself regularly, annually, typically, to identify anew where are the material risks? Because if I am successful in addressing some, they will go away and they will be replaced by other issues. And again, the complexity here is so large that you need to be very humble that it's not about 5 boxes and you tick 3, and then you're done with those, and then you have only 2, and you do one more, and then there is only 1, and then there aren't any. That's not how you should think about this. This is more about managing cycles and deepening understanding, and we will get new issues because of new decisions, whatever they are, and we will have to adjust constantly.
And I can also just add, you see in the questions also, there's one on how to actually define material issues in terms of the impact on business, right? And that's also where I was saying the way that we have approached that is to use an enterprise risk management approach, both for, you could say we do some then shorter term, there's also annual processes of enterprise risk management assessment or enterprise risk assessment. But then we also look at, for example, climate change as a longer term strategic issue, right? Both from a transition risk and physical impact perspective. So I think that is the tools that we have used so far have been drawn from let's say more classic risk assessment and longer term scenario planning. But in that context also, again, I wanted to actually ask Pia another question, because again, it's this that I'm also struggling with, how do we actually capture that broader enterprise value assessment, and you were mentioning again, forecast scenarios and assumptions, but and how can we manage then the risks again of coming out as a company with some quite challenging strategic risk information and again being exposed right to that potential risk of providing, is it too much transparency, too much disclosure? How do you think that will be handled by the financial sector?
Today, we talk to our investors on a constant basis. At least quarterly, we have, you can say, consensus updates to see where is the market. And I guess every investor relations department anywhere in the world does this. They're in constant dialogue with the analytical community in order to understand where the expectations are moving, and ensure that there is if not an alignment, because clearly there is a freedom of views, but at least that you put the right information out there to address issues as far as you can. And I think this will become a bit much more complex undertaking, where, yes, if you are required to provide a forecast, you will have to say, okay, let's use these assumptions. And boy, there will be opinions on those assumptions, and they will be differing in all sorts of ways, but fine, right? The market's always right. So these forward-looking views will transform the discussion to make the view on any company more forward-looking fundamentally. And that's an unintended consequence, because in order to have an enterprise value, you need to have an income statement and a balance sheet, and you need to say something about what revenues and costs are going to be over the very long term, then 20 odd years. If you do that, you will make assumptions, and these assumptions, some will say, yeah, we agree to your sales target, we don't believe in your costs. This is going to go X, Y, and Z instead of where you think it's going. And fine, but I think we are up for a new type of dialogue, yes, which is containing a lot more of forward-looking information, if we decide to go all as the current proposal lies, one should add.
Before I'd like to spend the last few minutes in a second just talking a little bit more about the management level and board capacity to deal with these changes and some of the recommendations you have. There was one question now though on how do you think this changes companies' relationship to their suppliers, and how might companies start de-risking some of those supplier relationships, especially in terms of when companies don't get the right information, for example. Do you have any reflections on that?
I often present this particular slide saying that this looks more like a military undertaking than a piece of legislation. And I think we are looking at geostrategy here, right? So the questions of insourcing, resourcing, offshoring, onshoring, these are questions that are going to be very critical. And there are clearly countries that will be struggling to maintain the level of foreign trade they have had recently. And there are others that may benefit. I dare say that parts of Africa might come into play in a way no one foresaw, with positive consequences, perhaps a lesser pressure on Europe and migration, for instance. So we don't know, but there is the tectonal plates are moving, right? This is geostrategy.
Yeah, so you see potentially full on regional shifts in terms of supplier bases.
Yes.
Lene, what are your?
I mean, I can also, so more from a corporate value chain perspective here, right? So there's no question that again, the requirements for us to ensure that we apply this impact assessment view across the full value chain will mean that we will have to work also more with, in particular, strategic suppliers. But again, in principle, and how, because the wording in the draft standards right now is basically, potentially encompassing everything, right, in the up and downstream all tier suppliers. So that's again one of the challenges, right? But if we then try and take a more let's say constructive approach and say, okay, at least we'll work with strategic suppliers, just as we see on scope 3, right? We will have to take a more directive approach to actually work with how do we actually drive down emissions in our supply chain. So that is part of this. The question is going to de-risking strategies, right? It will push us to work more directly with our suppliers to address some of these impacts in our value chain. So again, that would be I would say the potential positive way of interpreting this requirement for SMEs. This will mean that all this transformation that we're talking about in corporate reporting, this will translate into massive requirements, right, to SMEs in global value chains to also provide data and to certainly to not be dodgy related to the question here, right? We will require them to provide documentation of their responsible business practices and how they are avoiding impact. So it's going to be a tsunami of requirements also to them.
And maybe a quick response before we go to the more high-level recommendations. I mean, we haven't talked about SMEs much, but from your comments, it also seems like reasonable to assume that SMEs are just going to be that much more careful about what they do in the first place in these areas, because how would they otherwise deal with that kind of data demand from companies such as yours?
Well, that would be I guess an optimistic way of looking. Let's hope that they will be more careful and will incorporate also sustainability perspectives strategically in the way that they operate their business. But of course, we know that this is something that will need to be also translated in a way that makes it more operational for smaller companies that do not have the capacity necessarily. I'm talking about from Maersk's perspective. It's also going to be a challenge to get hold of all this data, but certainly for smaller companies, it's going to be even more challenging. And I don't know. I mean, I think there could also be a risk, which we also see already now with the taxonomy reporting requirements today, right, which are already coming out or are already required today, where I certainly see some of the way that that is being talked about in is that some companies are simply not reporting on it, right? Because they're just kind of giving up because it's too complex, it's too challenging. So that could be a similar challenge with some of these wider reporting standards that we're talking about here.
But I think to add to that, that what is required and what needs to happen is that the truck owner or the owner of an excavator that has to dig a hole for Novo Nordisk, whatever, when they buy their equipment, it's not just buying the equipment, it's buying a data feed from the seller of that equipment that ensures more or less automatically my accounting system can receive that data. And when I send an invoice electronically, obviously using XBRL, so it's machine readable straight into the receiving company's books and ledgers, the required sustainability data is already in there.
Yes.
I.e.,
So,
if I use this equipment X hours, it produces XYZ consequences. And
so
yes, this is a massive call for invention and re-engineering. Right? There are lots of people that will make money out of this, tons of money. Creative people will start re-engineering.
Yeah, and I guess with the material passports, legislation is also coming for EU level. The start of something like that is coming. You can only see that develop much further. I think it's some interesting future we're charting out. We just have 3 minutes left. I'd love to hear a minute and a half, each of you, just some recommendations if you were to, what should board members now do as next steps to understand this and start dealing with this? What can they do more practically? Maybe Lene first.
Yeah, so I can start. So there's no question that starting with a materiality assessment is certainly the right way to go. To companies, boards absolutely need to have an understanding of where their material impacts are. And how these issues may pose, financial risks or impacts, also have impacts on the business. Perhaps there's 2 things I would say. So one is I definitely also encourage boards, everyone on this call as well, to review the standards, to make sure that everybody gives feedback to the EU, to EFRAG as part of this is the window, right, to give the feedback and influence the direction, the development of these standards. But in any case, I also agree with Pia. We're not going to have, massive changes, I don't think, to the standards. Much of it is going to look as we see in the standards. So we absolutely, all of us need to get started, right? We need to begin to work strategically with understanding these issues and risks.
Yeah, I would say the board and the executive management of companies need to set aside time to have put it a seminar and discuss the outline of what's coming and start thinking about roles and responsibilities and how to organize to have the process or over time establish that process that allows the board to feel confident that when they get the bottom-up reporting of here are the year's material sustainability risks, and there are some changes, as you can see from last year, they can rely on that, and this can be made a part of external financial reporting. So roles and responsibilities, and read the regulation, and realize thereby the width of what's going to come. That I think is where you need to start now.
Thank you. We've come up to the hour. I think we've. It's obvious from our discussion that there's a lot of moving parts in this. There's a lot of uncertainty about what's actually going to happen. It's a lot of these are very systemic issues about data management, about corporate risk management, about changing supply chains. All, I think, good arguments to bring this high up in the agenda, as we also heard now at the end from Lene and Per. Thank you so much for joining. I think sure this is only the start of many of these types of discussions over the next months. Again, there's a Danske Industry event as well in middle of June on this. And thanks everyone, and good luck in making sense of this over the next years and working with it.
Thank you, and good luck everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.